Thank you all for being here and the fourth panel today. So we talked a lot yesterday and today about free and fair elections. We talked about elections in different parts of Europe. We've just talked about elections in Belarus. So now we're moving our geographical focus a little bit towards the West. We're going to be talking about free and fair elections in the EU and what kind of election observations do we need, what kind of EU role is there to be considering elections. And we have a great panel today. We will have Meaghan Fitzgerald speaking in front of ODIHR. Meaghan is the head of elections for ODIHR. Pierre Peytier from ENEMO, so domestic observation, also head of elections. Busuleanu from EPDE, program manager, and Zofia Lutkiewicz, political accountability foundation vice president. Yes. And before we move to our panelists, Sławomir Szyszka will present the main findings of the report that they did on a very topical issue, and that's the state of domestic observation or civil citizen election observation in the EU. So, Sławomir, please give us the baseline here.
Thank you for this invitation for the Unhack Democracy and for the EPDE and also for possibility to share our findings. We, which in EPDE think that citizen election observation it's have huge potential, which is still not used in the European Union. And for these reasons, we decided to diagnose the situation and to look whether how observers operate, citizen observers. We asked questions. One, whether observers can observe voting and counting procedures in their home countries, and found out that 15 states, which is around half of them, have legislation that open to citizens these procedures. Also, we analyze whether states, European Union states, recognize the very status of the citizen observers and mention them in electoral law. And only nine states have such words or, in fact, status as citizen observers. So it's around 1/3. Not impressive number. Anyway, we look also into recommendations because since 2000, ODIHR formulate in total 90 recommendations to all current EU member states related to the rights of citizens to observe elections. The recommendations were offered to all but 2 states, and we found out that only 5, but in fact 2, because this order should be rather partially implemented all the recommendations. So it's around 10% of states. And we're talking about recommendations actually to enhance the ability of civil society to contribute to the electoral integrity, because that was the aim of these recommendations. Other thing interesting that we found is certain trend. There was some improvement over the years, but very slow. Few states implemented the status legislated for observers. 2016, Estonia, 17, Slovenia, a year later, Poland and Lithuania. But what is interesting, after 2018, it stopped. I know no single case of state, despite all this pressure on our democracies, on our electoral processes, that states will open access to electoral procedures to their own citizens to observe them. Citizens all over Europe conduct various kinds of observations. Some group only for election day, other try observe entire process. But we have also plenty groups that use their own specific expertise and observe only one specific subject. For example, campaign finance, access for voters with disabilities, media, disinformation. What it's common for all these groups is that they face certain kind of challenges to be able to fulfill, to use the full extent this tool. And one of this challenge I already mentioned, access to the proceedings, to the electoral proceedings, electoral commissions, courts. Other includes access to the financial resources. It's hardly possible to conduct observation mission that lasts many months, basing only on volunteering. Other difficulty is limited possibility to transmit the findings and assessment into the public policy. Big problem is lack of the trust, understanding and knowledge actually on what observers do, what they can observe, how they operate, and how this tool can be used for the benefit of our elections. Far too often, all the time, still observers, especially in developed democracies, are considered as fraud searchers, fraud preventing mechanism. This is a very narrow understanding what we are actually doing and what citizens can contribute. Few concluding remarks. Why states, European Union states, but also European Union and European Union institutions should do more for better legislation for observers and to support, facilitate citizen observation. I made a list of 10 points, and I'm sure there is even more very important reasons. I will mention only few of them. One of them is that states already promised this to the citizens, because subscribing to the OSCE commitments, to the ECCPR, they commit to that there should be independent scrutiny of voting and counting process, and I consider that it will be appropriate for the EU states to respect their own citizens and what was promised. Other reason is the matter of credibility. The European Union is observing elections globally on all continents, and recommends the same things on access to all citizen observers in other countries. So I think we should use the same standards also for us, especially that they based on frequently on the same legal basis. But perhaps the most important reason for this is that citizen election observation is actually ideal mean for activating citizens, educating them in electoral processes, making them engaged in our democracies. And from my practice as election observer since 2006, I'm completely sure the person who even observe for one day counting votes for the rest of life will look in different way on democratic system, and for sure will be among us as one of the defenders of rule of law and the democracy. Another reason is that our democracies are under threat, but the threat comes also from rapid changes, social and technological. Actually, every few years we need to change or make some amendments to electoral law, and there is huge role for observers to find the risk area, to recommend what can be changes, to work as early warning mechanism before problems that each country have, various kinds, not become even more serious. Usually, if we talk about electoral law, there is one rule that problems that appear during one electoral cycle for the next can become much more serious. And there is huge role for citizen observers to contribute to electoral reform. Frequently, they have much better orientation and knowledge on various modern technologies and can react. closing remark, we should understand that citizen observers in the role that they can fulfill and which in the contribution that they can make cannot and will not be replaced by international observers in the European Union. We must count on ourselves to a large extent, and they also will not be replaced by and will not be by institutional supervision, very important, also conducted by various EU institutions, by our national institutions. And all these three elements should work together. And only then, I believe, we can have much stronger safeguards against various challenges. But for this, as at the beginning I mentioned, we need better legislation for the election observers, and we need more enabling environment that will encourage civil society groups and individual persons to do this very important service for our societies. And with I would like to finish with an opening question to our panel of experts. What actually we can do to move forward from the situation we are for now in terms of legislation and conditions for observers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sławomir, very much. I think we will have time to maybe come back to some of these questions in the later section. So if you would be available to join us later, that would be great, maybe to answer some of the questions for the others. Thank you. We also had the 6 panelists appearing on the Zoom, unexpectedly, I think. But let's turn to the panelists here physically present. I would like actually to start with Pierre, and maybe precisely because we are talking about free and fair elections. What does that exactly mean? And is there still sense in talking about free and fair elections? Should we be talking about something else?
Thank you, Buyo, and thank you for the opportunity to be here in sunny Budapest. It's a real pleasure. So to address this question, I would have essentially 4 points I would like to make. I'll be brief on each of them, don't worry. But I hope that will answer your question from the perspective of ENEMO, which again is an international civil society election observation. So we sort of find that's the middle ground in between international observation and domestic civil society observation. So the 4 points. The first is a theoretical point, but I think it's important to mention. Is that when we talk about free and fair elections, absolutely those are fundamental, crucial concepts for several reasons. First of all, because they're enshrined in international standards and international instruments which we have. And secondly, because as election observers, we rely on the concept of free and fair elections in order to formulate our assessments. The problem with these 2 concepts is that they're very performing, they're very good at explaining things when you're going into details of an election, but they're not very good at working to describe an election as a whole. To give you an example of that, in my role of head of mission in several countries, you meet with election stakeholders after an election, for instance, ambassadors. And one of the first questions that usually comes to mind and that they ask, they want insider information, they want to know, were elections free and fair? And you can guess what is the answer to that 100% of the time. Partially free, partially fair, which is the equivalent of saying nothing when you think about it. So in order to address that, a better question would be, were elections genuine? And this is where you have the notion of genuine elections as opposed to fake elections, which is also enshrined in the ICCPR, Article 25. So that does a much better job at describing an election as a whole. So ideally, the title of this panel should be genuine, free, and fair. Not to forget that I'm not saying we should exclude and move away from free and fair. I'm saying they are very good at explaining specific aspects of an election, which then can be discussed. But the first question first comes genuine. The 3 practical points I want to mention is basically related to, because we're not talking only about problems, but also about solutions that we can offer, is what can we do? What is the next step in terms of election observation in order not to keep on going around in circles and to really address some of the issues that we're seeing pop up more and more often. The first is long-term observation. I would say in the 90s up until perhaps the early 2000s, in the 90s when you really had election observation was gaining a lot of traction, you still had a lot of election fraud that was happening on election day. So, things like pressure on the voters in polling stations, family voting, ballot box stuffing, and Bulgarian carousel, these kind of things. I'm not saying this doesn't exist anymore. I'm saying that a lot of the things, at least in the countries where we observe, a lot of these things have sort of shifted away towards now we see more and more manipulations and contestants trying to gain an advantage in the pre-election period. So this is the era of blatant fraud on election day has sort of decreased, whereas you have now the pre-election period has become more and more significant. And what does that mean for us as both, I think, international and domestic observers, is that we need to continue, of course, observing election day. I'm not saying it's not important, but we need to mobilize more efforts in terms of quantity of observers and in terms of reinforcing the methodology on long-term observation. Because if we want to be able to seize these issues that are happening, again, mostly before an election, by election day, it's mostly done in that sense. We need to really improve the methodology. The second point I feel is important and also echoes one of the previous panels, which is about the media. The issue, and this is especially for international observers, when we arrive in a country, we are there for a few weeks, a few months at best. But the problem is that the work of the media, including on political and potentially election-related content, is continuous throughout the year. So even if you have the top level media analysts, media experts in the world, they're there only for a few weeks. So by definition, they cannot seize the entire complexity of what's going on when it comes to the media and the electoral process. If you add to that the fact that digital media platforms, social media have really exploded over the last few years, you have a problem where you need to reinforce the methodology. Another issue related to that is that media monitoring requires a lot of people. It requires sophisticated methodologies and it requires a lot of manpower, which often international missions don't necessarily have. Some more, I would expect that in ODIHR, of course, you have maybe an easier time with that, but at ENEMO, we're very limited in that. So again, trying to have a problem-solving approach. At ENEMO, we had this idea, which we're still working on, but it's to sort of develop a regional media monitoring hub that would operate not only during elections, but that would basically serve the function of better informing our international election observation missions when we deploy them to the countries, so that media experts arrive in country not just without anything, with a blank slate, but already are informed, and during the missions also are informed by these monitors who provide data on what's going on in terms of the media environments, the media oversight. And then both in conjunction, hopefully can strengthen the methodology on media components. And then last but not least, I would like to speak about the recommendations that election observers address. That this is a fundamental part of our job is also to not just provide an assessment, but also a final report with recommendations to key stakeholders, to decision makers. Okay. And the problem that we've seen more and more in recent years, and I know this also, I've had this conversation with people in the EU election observation missions in ODIHR, is that in some cases you have the legislators or parliaments or the ruling party which does something which is quite sneaky in that they will adopt a certain number of recommendations, but they don't adopt all recommendations. They adopt those which actually can serve their purposes. And they can find a specific angle also to that recommendation and say, look, we implemented that. Everything is good. We implemented this recommendation. But the problem is that they can also use it to gain an advantage. One example that comes to mind is recommendations on campaign finance, for example. If the recommendation is to lower the ceiling for donations or to, let's say, in general, make a framework that is more constraining on political and campaign finance, that can be used to the benefit of a ruling party, but also to sort of prevent smaller parties from actually gathering funds which they need for a campaign, or artificially limiting them on purpose. This is just an example. There are many others. But so essentially, election observation missions need to be very, very careful on following up how these recommendations are being implemented. And I know that the EU and the ODIHR does this, which I think is a great practice, which I will recommend all international missions do, which is follow-up missions. There are already these needs assessment missions for the mission to assess the conditions of the elections and what the mission would look like. But it's very important also for international observers to come back afterwards to follow how these recommendations are being implemented, if they're being implemented correctly and in which way, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's what I had to say to you. I hope that this will lead to a full conversation.
Thank you a lot. You had a really good remarks here that we can go back during the conversation. I would also invite the other panelists to reflect on some of these. And I would give the floor to Meaghan, precisely because, like, from the OSCE perspective, international organization, there are these international norms that you basically have to translate towards different specific countries when you design the election observation mission. So how does that work from your perspective? How does this look?
Thank you. And actually, I was going to pick up on one of the points that my fellow panelists just made, but also question exactly how practically does it translate into an observation mission when we look at the concerns in a specific country. And I really wanted to start with a question to the audience. And that was, how many of you would have seen if we decided not to send short-term election observers, election day observers to Hungary? How many of you would have seen that as a sign that we have less serious concerns about the electoral process in Hungary? I think, some of you may be more familiar with our methodology and therefore not have seen it as a sign, but I think the general public definitely would have. And that is the crux of the problem we have, because we do have this range of formats that don't necessarily indicate the seriousness of the concerns about the electoral process. There's not a direct correlation between those two. So we have, if I start with our smaller format of an election assessment mission, that assessment mission has all the same core experts on it that look comprehensively at the entire election process. But they don't have long-term or short-term observers. So they're not looking at it from a regional perspective and not looking at election day. The next format is adding the long-term observers to it. And then the final format is adding the short-term observers to it. And here in Hungary, we did decide to look at election day proceedings. Yesterday, we heard from one of our colleagues about the influence of local government on and public works systems on the formation of electoral boards. And we also heard a lot about the public trust in those that would handle any election-related disputes. And those were things that contributed to our decision to send short-term observers here. Also contributed to it was the fact that there aren't a system for domestic non-partisan observers, the fact that the opposition parties were coordinating and sending their party agents, organized by civil society, but still party agents to the polling stations. And we saw a potential for a contentious process where an independent external voice would have been valuable. But our concerns, our seriousness of the concerns in Hungary, a lot of them are very systemic and related to the pre-election environment, which is an ongoing theme we've heard from many speakers over the last 2 days, that the pre-election environment has a lot of impact and is much more determinable about the election results. And we have these election assessment missions in other countries. Currently, we are in France, just closing up our election assessment mission there. And that mission will still look at the entire election process. They just won't have the long-term observers there. But I mention this because it's actually a very topical discussion for ODIHR at the moment. This year, so far, out of 8 election observation missions we've had, 6 of them have been in EU countries. And I don't think many people realize that or know that. And because they are less visible, and there's less awareness of them. The smaller format of the assessment mission doesn't have a post-election day press conference and doesn't release a report immediately after election day. And that may be one of the contributing factors to why they're less visible. By the end of the year, 10 out of the 14 likely elections that we will observe will be in EU countries. So this year is particularly heavy for us on EU countries. But I think one of the challenges we're facing, again, is how we show this thoroughness and the level of concern. It can be reflected and can be addressed through different formats of the missions, because we apply the same methodology to all participating states, and we are likely to come to the same conclusions on a needs assessment mission if we don't hear concerns specifically related to election day. We won't be recommending short-term observers, and so we won't be recommending a full observation mission. And so we don't, but at the same time, we don't want to communicate, and we wouldn't have wanted to communicate here in Hungary that there are not serious concerns about the process. We have seen a trend in EU countries where our smallest format that I didn't even mention is an expert team, and that's when we don't feel that the process needs to be looked at from a comprehensive point of view, but just certain aspects of the process need to be looked at. But we've seen in countries where we previously sent an expert team, we're now sending an election assessment mission, for France, for example. Or in countries where we previously sent an election assessment mission, we're now adding long-term observers. And like Hungary, for example, was an example where we previously had long-term observers, and now we added short-term observers. Ultimately, I think some of it will come from looking at the specific topics and making sure we have additional analysts on those missions to look at the emerging topics that have been discussed over the last 2 days, but I won't repeat for time's sake. Really, ultimately, the solution, I feel, lies with our domestic observer colleagues and what they can do, and with the intent that we would just be there to complement them and reinforce some of their findings and hopefully amplify their voice. But our colleague who presented the report mentioned some of the things that we can do in terms of making the recommendations about domestic observation stronger. And ODIHR can definitely look at that and look at really concretely making sure that in EU countries where it's not provided for, we are advocating for that and including recommendations on it. Also, we feel that, and we repeat many times in our discussions with EU countries, that EU countries can support ODIHR as an institution by being more open to observation themselves, self-reporting on our observations, and inviting the follow-up that you mentioned and other colleagues have mentioned.
Thank you very much, Meaghan. Maybe I would turn directly now to Adam. And maybe you can continue basically from this same direction, but from a different perspective of a representative of basically a coalition of domestic observers, right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much for having the opportunity to speak here today, and thank you to the Unhack, Zofia, Elliot, and Garvin for organizing this series of excellent and very interesting discussions. My notebook is full of notes, so it's really amazing that we can finally meet here and talk from a different perspective the whole issue of democratization and election observation and the diverse and very serious challenges to both elections, to the institution of election observation, both domestic and international. And yeah, and we are meeting here in Budapest. I mean, Unhack is our newest member of the EPDE. EPDE is working in Eastern Partnership countries and in some European countries, including Poland and Hungary. We've been listed undesirable organization in Russia, so we cannot work with our colleagues from Golos, from Russia. But we are still looking at elections also in this country. What I wanted to say, I tried to sort out if we are rethinking election observation. I mean, we with the publication we are preparing now together with Sławek. We want to make the point that actually there is not only the export of our best practices towards the east, but we have problems also in the EU that we actually do not provide for the opportunities and possibilities and legal framework for domestic election observation, which is, as we see, more and more needed also here. But I wanted to make 3 points on how we could improve the election observation. The conservative understanding of election observation is perhaps fact-finding and collection of evidences, right, and monitoring and reporting. But we are what we saw also in this and heard in the last 2 days here. We face different challenges now, and different to what we had in the last 10 or 20 years, right? We have campaigning moving from offline to online. We have disinformation issues. We have new voting technologies. All those new challenges require also, new forms of observation, right? And just to name maybe two examples of how to tackle it. And both examples are coming from Russia, where the citizen election observation is forbidden, basically, is not allowed by the law anymore. So what they do is, for example, they developed a tool of statistical analysis of official results. So they take all the results from the polling stations from the whole country and look at the irregularities. And it's a kind of a very powerful tool if you combine it with the observation in the polling stations. You can see the election fraud actually in the figures, in the statistics, and can better assess to what extent the elections have been manipulated. The second thing is, as you know, in some of the countries from our focus region, there are cameras in the polling stations, so the colleagues managed to hack basically the video recording from those polling stations and developed an internet IT tool to check the voter turnout. So which is done automatically, and they see and they saw during the last elections already, I don't know how many percent, 30 or 40%. Artificially increased voter turnout. So just as an example how we can observe, and all the tools to monitor disinformation and online media, etc. These are all those we need to apply in all the countries we're working, and also I think ODIHR and other EU missions, they will and they are also improving the methodology of the international election observation. But I think from our perspective, from the domestic election observers' perspective, these are tools we have to develop in all the countries. The second point is the resistance. You've been talking already about the follow-up on recommendations and different tools, how to improve the implementation of recommendations. There are plenty of them, as you saw, as you've heard also from Slavek. We have excellent databases of ODIHR, of EU, even EPDE has set up a database of recommendations of our member organizations. But those recommendations are hardly implemented in all the countries, as we've heard. Like 2 of the countries, right, of 27 in Europe implemented fully the recommendations of the international observation missions, which means that we have developed here some kind of new formats of like those follow-up missions, right, and include domestic election observers into the whole process together with the international organizations. I'm not talking only about ODIHR recommendations, right? We have GRECO recommendations, Council of Europe, etc., etc. There are plenty of organizations are making different recommendations related to elections. So we need kind of standard formats in between the elections to push for sustainable electoral reform, as Olga Aibazowska told us today. And the last point is the resilience, and we are observing the phenomenon of the so-called fake observation with EPDE in our focus region. This is the politically biased, politically motivated election observation, which is not only damaging the credibility of the elections among the local audience, right? But it's also damages the credibility of the institution of election observation. What we need is to strengthen the democratic institutions with our recommendations and with our work as election observers, because they are the safeguards of democracies. We cannot allow corrupt politicians to damage the institutions. I think these are the fields where we have to increase the action and develop new tools of the domestic election observation together with international institutions and international observers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. And last but not least, let's turn to Zofia, maybe for exactly this again, domestic perspective, and maybe you can tell us more about this. What was already mentioned in the panel, this differentiation between this conservative view or let's say like the old view of election observations that used to be very focused on election day and on fraud, and how this has actually expanded over time and has gained new meaning for us.
Of course. Thank you so much, and thank you to Unhack for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So let me tell you first a little bit about our organization. So I come from Poland, and the Political Accountability Foundation is a domestic watchdog, domestic election watchdog that was established after domestic observation was possible or was passed in Poland in 2018. So we are one of the lucky few countries, as Sławek mentioned, within the European Union who actually have domestic observers. Even though we can work in Poland as domestic observers, we still have some limitations, and for example, party observers or international observers have much more rights than we do. So we, for example, cannot observe the dispute resolution process, or we cannot observe the work of the Central Election Commission. So even though still having domestic observation in Poland is an achievement, there is still more that can be done. And just anecdotally, to tell you where we began as an organization and as a team of people, because domestic observation was not possible until 2018, we were actually observing elections in Poland as international observers sent by Russian organizations. So imagine the narrative around that. I won't.
Or German.
Yes, Russian or German. So either way, it's bad. So I wanted to talk to you about some of the challenges from the perspective of domestic observers. And I think what you mentioned, what has been mentioned here, that a lot of the narrative around election observation is focused on election day and what happens around the ballot box. And I think this is problematic because in many countries, especially in the European Union, but also thinking about Poland and Hungary, actually election day is important, but it's not as important as in some other countries or as it was before. So I think what needs to be done is we need to start talking about how comprehensive election observation can be, and that actually there is so much more to observe compared not just election day. So we have some colleagues from Romania who specialize in campaign finance. We have colleagues from Georgia who are doing so many different things. So I think, just focusing on issues such as social media monitoring or media monitoring in general, or campaign finance issues or changes to the legal framework. This is a long-term perspective, and as it was mentioned yesterday and today, we're actually working in an environment when electoral campaigns and political campaigns start the day after election day. So we really should change this paradigm and stop thinking about election observation as something that is focusing on one single day, but it's actually a 24/7 effort. Another point that I wanted to make is that we, especially as domestic election observers, we don't necessarily have the capacity to focus on all the aspects of the electoral process. So we often work with different organizations in our home countries who are not necessarily as focused on elections, but for example have expertise in monitoring public media, which for example our organization doesn't. So I think one of the important things is to build those networks and build those coalitions with other organizations who have the expertise, because we as election observers domestically cannot be doing everything. And another point to that is there's not necessarily the need to be doing everything. I think as ODIHR has election assessment missions, we as domestic observers should also have a strategic conversation or an assessment of what is actually needed in our respective countries and what we should be monitoring. So again, speaking to your point about election day, from a Polish perspective, I don't necessarily think that we should be focusing so much energy on election day with some systemic issues such as the use of administrative resources or issues with public media that we have in Poland. However, I would also like to kind of stress the point that we are in a way as election observers expected to observe election day. And I think in some of the polarized society, and again speaking from the Polish example, I think even right now there is a lot of narratives. We are one year away from an election, but still, even at this point, you can hear different groups, including the opposition, saying that the election will be stolen. And I think just having this presence on election day and being able to come out the next day facing all of these accusations of fraud at the ballot box and be able to say and be the voice of reason and say we've observed in so many places, we saw this and that, and we didn't see some of the things that you're accusing people of doing. So just to be able to have this kind of perspective to counter some of the disinformation narratives that are really harmful to elections and to people's trust in elections is still important. And another point to that, I think we should be better prepared as election observers when it comes to strategic communication. So we should not only be able to better speak about what we do, and that election observation is not just election day, and that in general elections are not just about election day, but also to be able to communicate on who we are, what are our values, what is our methodology, what do we stand for, and I think this principle of non-partisanship in domestic observation is especially important, because it gives us the credibility to then be able to say, we have a methodology, we are non-partisan, we are here not to tell you who won or who lost, but we're here to tell you what happened and how to improve the process in the long term. And just to also speak to the point about observation in the EU, as it was mentioned by Sławek, there aren't that many countries where domestic observation is possible, and I think we should have a collective push also from some of the network organizations. And I'm looking at ENEMO and the EPDE, and we're happily both members of both organizations now. But we should have a bigger push for domestic observation in European Union countries, but also maybe with some of the, and I hope some of the donor organizations are also present here. I think funding for elections in the EU is really important, and not just for domestic observation, although it would be nice, but in general for election integrity issues. I think we really need to shift this paradigm, which I think unfortunately Poland and Hungary are shifting, that, you know, democracy in the EU is in a good shape. It really isn't in some countries, and I think people who are in charge of funding should realize that and should also dedicate some of their resources to supporting some of the people in this room who are working on election integrity issues within the European Union. Thanks.
Thank you. I will just continue where you just, I think, reached. I want to make just one question, and then we will open the floor to the audience. I think we more or less agreed, and especially after Slawomir's presentation, that there is no unified practice in the EU countries regarding the status of domestic observers, their legal status, and their competences given by the law. And I also think that it's quite clear that there is a complementarity between domestic observers and international observers, and precisely because of the challenges for democracy in many of the EU countries, which are becoming hybrid regimes where elections are not necessarily stolen on the election day, but they are heavily biased in favor of the incumbent. Domestic observers have a specific role that they can actually follow these processes for much longer than, for instance, international missions can, because if OSCE would be monitoring in all participating states for 4 years, that would be enormous organization, right? So my question is, what can we do? What is the way forward, if that is the right way? Or if we want to make domestic observation enshrined as an international norm, so that it doesn't happen that a country can simply change the law and reduce the competences of domestic observers, or simply, domestic observers waiting every year to see whether they will be allowed to observe elections or not. What is the way forward, especially because we have such a great audience here and very diverse, for different stakeholders? What is the way forward towards this?
Maybe I have a few elements of answer. I don't have a perfect answer to your question. It's a very good question, by the way. I think that there is a willingness, I think we've demonstrated that, both from domestic and international observers to observe within the EU. Now the question is, why is that so difficult? And one of the reasons is also the funding. And also the confusion sometimes, and it's not entirely the fault of the donors, but there can be at times, for example, states that are going to say, we're already giving money through the ODIHR or through the EU or whatever, so why would we also support, for example, also we're giving money to, in some cases, domestic observers. Why would we give money to other international observers such as ENEMO? That is something that, speaking from, again, my perspective, we've encountered as a struggle very often. Our point is that what we make is that we say there are three pillars to election observation. There's international, intergovernmental observations, for example, EU ODIHR. There's domestic civil society, non-partisan observers, such as yourselves. And then there's ENEMO, which is both civil society, but also international and non-governmental. So it's not easy to have all three. Ideally, that's the situation that's what you would have in every country. Of course, it's not always possible for the number of limits that we mentioned. I think we need to keep pushing. Maybe better networking, maybe co-fundraising efforts might be a way to do that. Better information also to give to international stakeholders about why all these initiatives are useful. There's several directions that this can take, but definitely we need to bring our shoulders in together.
Well, I think the idea of elevating the commitment to having domestic observers and supporting domestic observers is a great idea, and one that hopefully could be looked at from an EU perspective. It's much more very openly and honestly challenging from the OSCE's perspective. Our commitments are enshrined in such founding documents as the Copenhagen document that our colleague referred to. And it does include acknowledgement of the importance of domestic observers, but doesn't go the step further to committing states. New commitments are adopted by ministerial council decisions, which require consensus approval of all 57 countries. And I think I can leave that there. But like we said earlier, I think advocating for EU countries to take it on board themselves, also possibly approaching it through the EU. I know there is within the EU structures an election network amongst member states of officials that work on elections in the EU member states, and maybe they could be a forum to talk to. And we would continue recommending the changes in the legislation, but.
Yeah, but providing the status is actually only the beginning of the whole story, and the status has also be comprehensive. I mean, this is what you said, so that okay, you have there is a status of citizen observers eventually in Poland, but you cannot do this, you cannot do this, you don't have an access to this and that. So this has to be kind of. So we have to increase our advocacy for providing this kind of comprehensive picture and status of the observers, and we have to be clear. And this is actually what Olga said today, that democratic election and observation. Is securing democratic elections is about security. It's about our security, right? And the EU has to acknowledge that and understand that there is a sense of supporting election observation in the member countries. Because they play a very important role, or can play a very important role, and has to improve the capacities of those organizations. I mean, if we look at the great job of Septimius and the expert forum in Romania, right? I mean, how many people people are there, experts are there who are doing this kind of job. Not so many. Because why? Because there is no support for them, actually. So we need more experts. We need more funding to increase the capacities of the election observers in the EU member countries. And we have to think more about merging the actions of international institutions, including experts of ODIHR, and working in formats which allow for a joint operations, especially between the elections and on the implementation of recommendations.
Maybe a quick comment.
Sure. So I would say definitely, I mean, status is one thing. I'm happy to have status in Poland, but I would rather dedicate the efforts to making domestic observation possible in Hungary, and then on the domestic market, working with international observers such as ENEMO or ODIHR to kind of get access to places where we cannot have access. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, I think there is a lot of reluctance on the part of the European Union. But I still think this is decreasing. I think if you look at the last couple of years and some of the rule of law mechanisms that the EU launched against Poland and Hungary, I feel like the European Union itself is changing a bit with its approach to actually how it treats democracy and rule of law issues within its own member state. So I would see some opportunity there. However, I still feel like we as domestic observers and as networks need to do more on strategic communication and on communicating actually what observers do, and that we are people who do not have a partisan agenda, because I feel like a lot of the fear, both in international institutions but also among donors, is the fear of funding or taking part in something that's kind of gets into the issue of influencing domestic politics, and I think this is a big fear, and we need to work on how to counter that.
This is a much more difficult position for domestic observers than international. We have time for a quick round of questions, I believe. One round of, or we don't have time.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yes. So please.
Very quick.
Yes. We can do that.
A bit provocative question, if I may. Given I'm a citizen of a hippie political regime, opposition-minded, and I see that my government wins elections after elections with a limited fraud. Okay, they are criticized but not heavily, so they can live with it. Why should I keep trusting elections if I see that elections don't serve as a mechanism of change, but instead it serves as a mechanism of continuing the power for the current regime?
Great question.
An easy one. Is there anybody else who would like to raise a question, and then we can turn back to the panel?
Or anyone who wants to answer that?
I can ask a quick question. I just want to say that we invited the National Election Office, 3 people from the Hungarian National Election Office, and multiple times, and we didn't get a response. So what is your advice? What we should do to involve state institutions?
And seconds, and yeah, I have one comment and one question. So regarding, you were saying about promoting what we do, and I think many times the organizations who observe elections are afraid to explain what they do, because I mean, you have your own methodology and it might be sensitive sometimes, but what we try to do is put everything on the table. I mean, because first of all, people know what to expect when they come to work with you. And the second thing is, I think our reports, which follow very closely the structure of the OD report, made a difference in public opinion when there was a question, was it fair or was it, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. So I think it's very important to explain what you did and how you did it, because otherwise, you know, you might look at a very obscure entity. But my question was, I know ODIHR can provide support to countries, so they can request for help if they need to change the legislation or something. How often do they come to request for help?
So, in order to respect the human right to coffee break, just very, very quick answers, please.
Yeah, I'll start with the last question. Quite often, but there are certain countries that do it quite often, and other countries that don't request. We provide, as ODIHR, we provide, sometimes together with the Venice Commission, legal opinions on changes to electoral legislation, but not only, other legislation related to human rights. We get opinions more often when we have an interlocutor or we have a person within that is able to request, like an ombudsman or a national human rights institution that can request it, or a very active committee in Parliament. So it varies drastically by country, but we get quite a few of those. I mean, as an office, together with the colleagues that do other legal opinions, we do probably about 30 a year. So we're doing quite a few of those legal opinions. And other requests are also there, whether it's participating in working groups and stuff like that. Since it's kind of an opportunity to say last comments, I just wanted to say that well, funding is also an issue for us, believe it or not, but it is an issue for us, and we're reliant on those same states wanting to prioritize observing in EU countries, which is a challenge because they prioritize other countries and don't send us the observers. But I think we're really here to complement one another and not duplicate. I think we each have a distinct role, and that's why we have to keep some separation, but in order to protect the value of each of our work, and we have a distinct role, but that role is to complement one another and support one another. And Mikhail, your question, I think it was really for the authorities, but I mean, why should they continue to, if they lose public trust, all public trust, which a lot of countries are losing public trust, then it's a crisis for them.
Maybe just also to Mihail, I mean, you as an observer, as a citizen observer, you are also a citizen of the country and a voter, and you are permanently there, and you have a huge organization behind you, which is doing a great job in voter education. I think this is a key. I think this is a key to this problem, right? And on how, and your question, Zofia, how to work better with the MPs. This is actually what I would love to develop with the EPDE, and to work more with the EMBs on the implementation of recommendations. One of those organizations which was recently dissolved and is trying to establish itself is the ICEO, and Istvan is here, who's managing program manager of the former ICEO. Through this kind of formats, through this kind of associations and cooperation, we could achieve better results in this field, definitely. I hope, at least, that we can contribute with EPDE also to this process, to setting up, this kind of platform of discussion, which is meaningful, which has an impact on the implementation of reforms.
Thank you, Adam. And maybe we can continue the discussion at the break.
Yes.
Yes, let's do that a little bit. So thank you all for talking with us today, and thanks for inviting us all here today to discuss this issue. That's it.